Here we go.
Hello, class. This presentation covers the period from 1945 to 1960, which was a period of significant cultural change spurred on by the growth of technology, the end of World War II, and through the influences of social groups that challenged the way average people perceive the world. Next slide, please. The United States government was a significant contributor to the change in culture. This was accomplished using popular culture to further the message of anti-communist sentiments to the public. The Nazis were effective in creating social movements using rhetoric and propaganda, inspired a young generation to fully integrate into their Third Reich. After returning from World War II, United States politicians and government figures considered the emerging communist bloc in Eastern Europe to be the most significant threat in rising U.S. presence on the world stage. Almost immediately, a campaign began utilizing popular culture mediums like radio shows, TV and theater ads, and even children's toys and collectibles. The principal goal of the government was to turn public sentiment against the communists and instill the concept that these political figures across the world were a significant threat to our freedoms. Next slide. This form of propaganda is represented in many cultural artifacts using a collection of celebrities and public heroes like stars such as Ronald Reagan. Using very charged language to describe the communist efforts and the United States efforts, these ads painted a very select viewpoint of popular issues at the time, and by using figures that are relatable to the average person, like Reagan, it appeared to give some credence to the purpose of the ad. This ad was used to explain the importance of a donation program for a radio tower in Europe. If you'd like to go ahead and play the ad. I'm not sure if the audio is actually playing here, but in the ad, Reagan actually describes the bell as very like patriotic and talking about how the efforts of this donation like helps crusade for freedom and talk about how the communists dominated the people of Europe, especially like Eastern and Western Germany. You know, besides the TV ads and newspaper articles, the anti-communist propaganda was present in many other different outlets, even children's collecting cards. Next slide, please. Here you see some that were actually taken out of bubblegum packaging. It was actually a pretty unique effort that I didn't even know existed before this project. Did some reading through the Gilder Lehman Institute of History. The images like this ad with Reagan are skewed in both visual representations as well as terminology that are on the cards themselves. Next slide, please. These images paint a telling picture. In the first slides from the previous slides, there was a specter of death over New York. You know, the government agent was rifling through a person's property, and there was a picture of Mao in a rendition that makes him appear as a ghoul, as the card described him as a warmonger. There is certainly a formula here, like we discussed in Module 5 on pretty much all of this propaganda. It's very charged language that denounces the communists, their crimes. You know, in these two ads, the lower one talks about slave labor and how the communists use it to, you know, build their country up. And the one above that, it actually depicts a battle from Korea War and talks about how the United States are allies or heroes in those combat roles. They serve to reinforce and create stereotypes about those people from, you know, communist China, Russia, the Soviets, and whatnot. And these stereotypes survived for many years after the war was over, the Cold War, and it still kind of propagates itself with older generations. Next slide. The 1950s, that followed the end of the Korean War, critical free thinkers like Allen Ginsberg came to the forefront of what was later referred to as the Beat Generation. You often hear the term beatnik. That's where this comes from. This group of artists and writers challenged the way people valued others and their identities and led to the growth of the early years of the civil rights movement. The divide grew between the more conservative generations and this generation due to the more prevalent liberalism and the erosion of what older generations perceived as traditional moral values and the acceptance of concepts deemed to be taboo. This divide was deepened as television sets began to enter every household, as well as radios, leading to more exposure for these artists in the next topic, rock and roll music. Next slide, please. Rock and roll received a significant amount of negative media coverage for acts like Elvis and Johnny Cash. These new artists played a new sound, utilizing newer instruments like the electric guitar, paired with new types of performances. Elvis in particular was often looked down upon by these more reserved generations due to his appearance, as well as the way that he performed his music and his dance integrated with his performance. And with that, I turn the presentation over to Alyssa.
All right, so we are going to look at arts between our period of 1945 and 1960. So in this time, visual arts rose in popularity significantly. Art itself can vary not only in content, matter, and style, but also the way it's perceived. Typically, art's going to be divided into three categories that includes literature, performing arts, and visual arts, which is what I specifically found my research on. This can be something as simple as a play or even as big as a Broadway stage musical and a movie. So as art is subjective, a lot of people can just perceive everything differently, but there is one commonality amongst all visual art pieces, and that's being the fact that they're able to connect with their audience using just the sense of sight, especially if you doesn't need sense of touch or sense of smell. It's just visual. Next slide, please. So in popular culture, music's rose in popularity. In the 1950s, it became an ever increasing component of the theater scene. Two of the most famous and successful lyricists were Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein. They became known as Rodgers and Hammerstein. Their work became notorious with not only Broadway, but also film. Both had a very successful career working by themselves, but when they got together, that's when the real music, the magic of the music happened. According to Andrew Lloyd Webber, they had made their mark individually, but as collaborators, they created pieces that enchanted audiences and redefined the art form. The musicals that they created that were most popular were Carousel, South Pacific, and Oklahoma. Their work actually introduced a whole new style of theater that combined musical theater, comedy, and operetta techniques. Next slide, please. Two of the biggest musical icons of the time that were very specific to Rodgers and Hammerstein were Shirley Jones and Gordon MacRae. They starred in at least two of the shows together that were filmed in the 1950s. That would be Oklahoma, which was the very first movie that Rodgers and Hammerstein put out together, as well as Carousel, which you can see here in the image. Masterworks Broadway actually called Shirley Jones the quintessential American sweetheart through her work in the 1950s. That led to iconic status for both Jones and MacRae. Jones actually went on to earn an Academy Award for her work and later on pieces of music, and she stayed relevant in pop culture in the years to come. Next slide, please. So these performances captivated audiences many years ago, but they made a difference as far as the theater scene then and what we know now. One of the biggest goals that Rogers and Hammerstein had was to bring mainstream and media to the forefront of entertainment. This goal was attained and embraced by Americans, and it would be replicated and retold for generations to come. Great. And that is my part. So we are going to look at science and technology with Gabriella.
So the next element we're looking at is science and technology, and there were many scientific developments for both the military and general population at this time, but first we'll look into military more. So during this time period, America had just finished with World War II, they were entering the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and they were also entering the arms race, which was kind of a worldwide race at the moment. So it was kind of an impediment need for many countries to kind of be the major superpower. So it was all about who was having the most technological advancements and in the quickest amount of time. So the US started with their new instruments of warfare, like the aircraft, artillery, guided missiles, naval vessels, supporting electronic systems, and more. The acquisition of these major weapon systems had a few benefits because the US was able to be more prepared for war. They were more prepared since they had just come from the devastating effects of World War II. And even though the Cold War wasn't necessarily a physical war, they were still prepared and were taking precautions regardless. Some drawbacks, though, was the economic burden it had on the country. And this also instilled a lot of fear in citizens as war kind of became quote unquote more normalized, and people were kind of fearful of what this would mean for their safety or what their families in general. So, one of these major military weapons and scientific developments during this time was the hydrogen bomb. This was in the early 1950s, and this was said to be more deadly and powerful than the atomic bomb that had ended World War II in 1945. And there was a lot of controversy around this because people didn't really know what this would mean for the world if more people got kind of power behind this weapon. So there were a lot of celebrity scientists during this time who were kind of well trusted in this realm of physics because they had a lot of studies and a lot of findings that were well proven. So one of these was Edward Teller. He was considered the father of the hydrogen bomb. So he was obviously for it. He thought it would be a good move for America in their defense mechanisms. Whereas there was another celebrity scientist as J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was one of the lead physicists that developed the atomic bomb during the Manhattan Project, and he was kind of scared for what this would mean, and he didn't really think the hydrogen bombs should be used as a weapon. There was also the use of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. These were used in the escalation of the worldwide nuclear arms race. This became pretty alarming for a lot of American citizens because this would allow nuclear warheads to be launched across Earth very quickly and it would allow them to destroy their targets. So, overall, from the mid 40s to the mid 60s, it was a scary time for the citizens of America as the possibility for war kind of became more normalized. So while there were many military technologies that were kind of out of the citizens' control, there were also a lot of household technologies that a lot of citizens were able to experience from the comfort of their homes. So the economy really soared during this time as the public started to purchase many new consumer goods, like electric refrigerators, dishwashers, washing machines, television sets, high fidelity phonographs, and transistor radios. So as the popularity of these household technologies grew, they began to be integrated into the general population's everyday rituals. So an example of this is instead of listening to the morning news like they normally would on the radio, they started to watch it more on the television. They also started listening to music on their phonographs and record players rather than always going to live performances like they always did. This isn't to say that live performances weren't so popular, it's just to say that now music was now more accessible to listen to in their homes. So an example of one of these household technologies that made everyday life easier was the automatic washing machine. And this really revolutionized how laundry was done because instead of having to have a wash tub and hand wash every single one of your pieces of clothing by hand, you were able to put them into a machine with just some laundry detergent and it would take care of it by itself. So this mostly impacted the stereotypical housewife at the time There were different roles of the wife and the husband. The housewife was typically the woman who stayed at home, took care of the kids, did all the daily chores around the house, whereas the man went out and had a job. And that's kind of where that stereotype stemmed from. Whereas today we see, women have more opportunities and more opportunities for education as well. So as you can see in these ads, a lot of these technological household appliances were more aimed at women, and it not only allowed them to be able to do their household tasks a lot more easier and a lot more efficiently, but it also allowed the people of America to develop a better sense of hygiene as the popular culture started to consist of cleaner clothes, which may seem like a normal thing now, but back then it really wasn't as common for people to have a lot of the hygienic practices that we do now. So then there was also science in medicine. So people wholeheartedly believed in progress and were excited of what futuristic life would entail. So part of this was the science in medicine. With new drugs and vaccinations, it really paved the way for curing and preventing disease. The public became a lot more hopeful of the new developments that would improve the culture's overall health, especially with these new hygienic measures being put into place. Unfortunately, there was also the Contagion scandal of the 1960s, which was considered the biggest man-made medical disaster ever. It was where pregnant women around the world were prescribed thalidomide to relieve morning sickness. However, it resulted in hundreds of children to be born with severe congenital malformations. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because while there were a lot of improvements that were made with these science and technological advancements, there was also a lot of limitations to it. They had to go through a lot of trial and error, but a lot of people were still looking forward to what new science could mean for the future. And I think that's it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.